Postman, the popular API testing platform that's worth billions of dollars, is exposing people's passwords and API keys in at least 2% of all publicly exposed Postman workspaces. Truffle Security is releasing an open source Postman secret scanner so that you can find those passwords and API keys and help get them cleaned out of there.
Postman on Wednesday raised $225 million in a new financing round that values it at $5.6 billion, up from $2 billion only a year ago.
Hello.
Hello.
Who are you?
I'm Joe. I'm a security researcher at Truffle Security. Previously, I was doing web app security for an offensive security company. I've developed some. That's me.
How long have you been doing security? Just
6 years, 7 years?
7 years. All right. Just backing up a second. A couple of years ago, I had never even heard of Postman. And now it's so popular. There's 250,000 live workspaces. What is Postman? What is a workspace? Why is this tool sort of exploded in popularity the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to APIs, and microservices architectures are more and more common. It's easier and easier to use APIs as somebody that doesn't code a lot. And Postman's like the default tool for both designing and testing APIs. It's super easy to import API documentation. And then like literally in the app, you can send one-off HTTP or whatever other protocol like WebSocket requests, review the responses, manipulate headers, auth, whatever you need to do to make sure that the API is working as you expect, or just testing out the API.
What is this video that you're watching? A totally reasonable question to be asking 2 minutes in. I'm Dylan, the CEO of Truffle Security, and we make open source tools for finding secrets, API keys, and passwords where you don't want them to be, like Postman. Postman is an incredible tool for developing and testing APIs, but security researcher Joe Leon found that the fuel that's powering all of the API development and documentation are API keys that are systemic to making the Postman platform work, but also result in thousands of leaked secrets throughout the platform. This video is an interview between me and Joe to try to understand how all those different keys leak out, and this video is an announcement of a new tool that we're open sourcing that's a submodule of TruffleHog that enables us to scan for, detect, and validate all of those keys in the Postman platform.
Tell me about what you found. How many live API keys did you find publicly exposed on Postman?
So we confirmed 1,700 live unique credentials representing 183 different types of secrets. So like root AWS keys, Datadog tokens, Stripe secret keys, a whole bunch of others. The most common was a sensitive URL with like basic auth or like a Slack webhook token. And that was from sampling 40,000 public Postman workspaces.
How many total keys do you think are in Postman? I mean, you found 1,700, but how many total do you think are out there?
Yeah, my best guess, like conservatively 4,000 live keys, but I bet like many, many more. And so let me explain like why I came up with that. So when we initially found the 1,700, we had a bias in our sampling. We specifically looked for workspaces that contained secret names like AWS, Stripe, that TruffleHog can detect.
Okay, I had to just jump in here and explain a few things. In Postman, you can't just enumerate all the public workspaces, but you can put a search parameter in, and a resulting list of workspaces that match that search will get returned to you. And so what Joe did initially was he just looked for proof points that there were AWS keys, Stripe keys, OpenAI keys, and to do that, he just looked for the words AWS, Stripe, and OpenAI. But that doesn't give you the answer to how many workspaces are exposing keys, because those search parameters are more likely to return keys. So what Joe needed was a control, a set of search parameters that would be agnostic to whether or not there were keys there. And so he developed a list of search parameters like v1, API, prod, that all APIs are uniformly going to have those terms. And then he searched those workspaces for secrets.
And that left us with about 6,500 workspaces. We ran 3 trials of 1,000 workspaces each without replacement, and ended up finding that on about 2% of the time, a workspace will leak a key, at least one key. The average was like 1.3. There's not really 0.3 keys, but the math works out like that. So
at this point, if you're still confused and you're wondering why are there so many passwords and API keys leaking on this platform, I'll try to break it down. Most sensitive APIs require authentication. Postman is designed to work with all APIs, sensitive and not. Postman is a platform designed for transacting data with APIs. It's a powerful tool to be able to experiment around with an API without actually needing a fully built out client to talk to that API. But if some of the APIs you're talking to require authentication, Postman is going to need that authentication to be able to talk to the API for you if Postman is sort of serving as that client. So Postman has a way for you to load up passwords and load up API keys to talk to those APIs. But the problem is, Postman is also a collaboration tool. It's designed for you to be able to build a workspace to talk to an API and then share that either with a set of people or with the whole world. And the breakdown is when you build a platform that's designed to talk to authenticated APIs that require your users to load up passwords and API keys, and then you build a bunch of sharing and collaboration tools to share all of that with multiple people, you inevitably end up in situations where people load up their workspace with a bunch of passwords and API keys, and then they share those workspaces with people that probably shouldn't have access to those API keys and passwords. And the kicker, the cherry on top of it all, is that Postman charges to be able to share your workspace with a set number of people, but doesn't charge to be able to share your workspace with the world. And so if someone is trying to get by with using the free version of Postman, but they want to share their workspace with their coworkers, the easiest way without paying money is to set their workspace public. And that is how we end up with passwords and API keys exposed over thousands of publicly exposed workspaces.
But all that math works out to 4,000 live keys is our best estimate. But again, just manually reviewing, I saw a lot of keys that are very hard for us to detect without internal network access, like an internally developed app. That leads me to believe there's a lot more out there. I'm so confident that there's like significantly more than 4,000 secrets because, again, like just 10.10 yielded 200,000 requests that were publicly available that had that URL. I would highly suspect, given how many other secrets we found, that there's a lot of secrets sitting in there. Just like I can't test them. Like I have no idea if they're valid. And at Truffle Security, we pretty much only discuss like valid keys that we find. But like if I was looking at like just keys that I found, like hundreds of thousands, like there'd be so many, but we're only like concerned about unique live credentials. Releasing, and we'll discuss this in a second, an open source Postman scanner in TruffleHog, that maybe this shines a light a bit more on Postman and the amount of secrets that are in there. And so users can better protect themselves to realize that they're exposing secrets, but also just generally the community recognizes that there are a lot of secrets leaking on Postman, and that might nudge Postman along to perhaps prioritize first before other features, fixing some of these issues. So I'm super excited about this. Was it December of 2023? We had a few community members and customers asking for the ability to scan Postman. That launched this big research project. There was a proof of concept, and now all of a sudden it's baked into open source. So we're really excited today to officially announce that users of the open source TruffleHog tool, which you can grab on GitHub for free, can point TruffleHog toward a Postman workspace, collection, or environment, and TruffleHog will scan for any of the 800 secrets that we currently support within the environment.
And does that work on both public and private workspaces?
Yeah, so we are using the official Postman API. And so that means that any workspaces or content within that workspace that you can access with your token, you'll be able to scan.
Are there any limitations in this scanner or anything from your research that the TruffleHog scanner isn't going to be able to get coverage for?
Definitely. I mean, this is a brand new release, so we couldn't put everything in at once, or else it would never get out the door. But also, like, TruffleHog's open source, so submit PRs to improve TruffleHog. So I'm hoping that the community, hopefully some watching this, will be contributing a bit to the Postman sub-module, as we call it, or scanner source. But yeah, so things that it can't do at the moment. So authentication within Postman is pretty wild. There's like 13 or 14 different types of built-in auth mechanisms for HTTP requests. We cover the most popular ones, like OAuth v2, AWS, like basic auth, bearer tokens, API keys, etc. But we're missing 6. So digest auth, NTLM, Hawk, I'm not entirely sure what that is, OAuth v1. So there's a few that we're missing, but I didn't really see a ton of keys in those, but we definitely want better coverage of those. A challenge that we had was, so like a database connection string. If you're breaking up the user from the password, from the host, from the database name, if all of that lives in different variables, it's hard for us sometimes to piece all that together to have like a clear string to test for, like, say, Postgres. So in that case, we won't always catch database strings. Postman supports more than just HTTP requests. They support WebSocket, gRPC, MQTT transactions. So those are not added, although I suspect those would be kind of easy to add. And finally, we mentioned history before. You can't access your own history via Postman's official API. There is an undocumented way to do that. So we'll be releasing a one-off script to help folks kind of just search their own history, but that is not a part of the official Postman submodule. The first thing I would love help with is just testing it, like, all over the place. The more people to test it, the better.
Okay, I get how Postman is used for testing APIs. Like, you can use it to send and replay requests, modify headers. Tell me how that leads to exposed API keys publicly.
Yeah, so unless the API that you're interacting with has no authentication controls, you have to add an API key, username, password, like whatever it is, into the app to actually test it and use it. And unfortunately, Postman's UI is extremely confusing, at least in my opinion, when it comes to handling secrets. So there's this concept of an initial value and a current value with regard to variables. So, like, imagine a variable is like API key. It's like a header, right? Um, Initial value, that, like, where whatever text you put in there is synced with Postman servers. And if your workspace is public, that's public to the entire world. Current value is supposed to be unique to your session, and that's like more private. The challenge is, like, those terms are extremely confusing. You know, I had to put on my security hat, go dig through their documentation to understand that initial value meant public and current value meant private. But you've got a lot of folks that aren't security minded, don't really care too much about security. Probably they're focused on just developing, which is fair. And it's not extremely clear that if you put something, a sensitive key, in initial value, it's then exposed to everybody to see.
Okay, so people are setting up workspaces so that they can talk to APIs,
Mm-hmm.
and they want that to be public, but then they go and they set certain values that are defined as initial values to be able to authenticate to their API, and those values are actually also made public, and that's where the confusion is coming from.
That's part of it. That, I mean, we definitely saw that a lot. Then there's also folks that probably don't realize that their workspace is even public because they're just tossing credentials all over the place in their workspace, forgetting initial and current value. Could just be directly in the URL as a parameter, and they might just not realize that anyone has access to it.
Tell me about the story of how a workspace gets made public. Does it start private and then get made public? Is the default public? How do 250,000 workspaces end up public in the first place?
Yeah, the default, as far as I'm aware, is not to make it public. You can make a private workspace public. You can create a public workspace off the bat. I think part of the challenge is, well, I think there's two things going on. I think one, people will just make things public to make it easier to share with others, or because they don't realize that there's a security implication. I think the other component is depending on how much you pay or if you pay for Postman, there are different like tiers and ability to share with peers within your company. If you're not paying for it, for example, it might just be easier to share with your whole team to just make it public. That's my best sense of what's going on. But again, I think probably by and large, folks just don't realize it's public or what the implications of it being public.
Okay, so maybe sometimes people just want to collaborate with their peers, and the easiest way to do that is to make it public, but then they don't realize the full consequences of making their workspace public and how many different people could get access to sensitive information.
Yes, I'd say that's true. And then one other thing I'll add in is there's the concept of forks in Postman, very similar to like forking on like on GitHub. So let's say a third party has API docs available on this public API network that Postman hosts. Super convenient. You can go grab a fork of those documentations, add in your keys, test it out. That's a very common workflow, seemingly. The challenge is if you create a public fork of that documentation and then plug your key in to test it, anybody can quickly build a list of all the forks for, say, OpenAI and identify how many keys are publicly available. And we did a test of all the publicly available forks of the OpenAI like API docs. 15% had live like ChatGPT keys in them. And so I think that's also another common source of leaking here.
And what are people mostly doing with those forks? If you take OpenAI's public documentation and you make a fork and then you put your key in it, is that the end of the story, or are people building on top of those forks or doing something extra other than just adding their key into a fork?
Mostly what I saw is just adding the key in and then running requests. I truly think it's just a matter of convenience for testing out an API to then include in your own app, and they're not actually like building on top of it in Postman. But we also couldn't, I forget how many thousands of forks there were specifically for OpenAI, but there were like many, many hundreds or thousands that were private. They just, you can't get access to them.
So do you think it's fair to say whatever the intended use case for forks is, the dominant use case currently is just to add an API key on top of documentation?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just OpenAI that we found this for. We found it for other organizations. I only bring up OpenAI because we know we've reached out to them to revoke the keys that we found, but there's a lot of other providers that you could just go find, get all their forks. It's easy to script that. And then boom, you have, I don't know, like 20, 30, 100 keys for that provider.
In the case of GitHub, when people fork a repository, they're usually building more on top of that repository.
Right.
But in Postman, when you fork a repository, it's often just to get an API key in so that your requests can go through.
Yeah, and that's what I see publicly. It is entirely possible that if you chat with like Postman's DevRel community or community lead, like they'll say, no, like actually people are building on top of it privately. That's definitely possible. But based on what I saw with the angle of looking for secrets, that's the conclusion I have. I mean, I saw so many instances of just putting secrets and keys aside, just API documentation just publicly available that was not needed to be public, like big companies that were exposing their documentation that clearly it's like a internal docs. I think a lot of people just accidentally or without really understanding the consequence make their workspaces public so everybody can see it. I mean, you can see how many people collaborate on a particular workspace or how many people have viewed it in the recent past. And there's definitely some of these high traffic, if you will, workspaces with a bunch of different users involved where there's keys sitting in there. So I would imagine it's, in that case, a bit of, oh, like, let's just drop the key in here. We can all use it and test with the same set of credentials.
In the world of Git, someone who perfectly knows the risks of exposing secrets can still sometimes expose them. It's an honest accident. If you do git add star, you might pull up a file you don't mean to. You might accidentally add a file you didn't mean to. Is there an analog to that in the Postman world where someone who perfectly knows the risks of exposed API keys may still end up exposing an API key?
Yeah, I think it's entirely fair to say that developer, whoever that's using it, could easily forget that they are syncing whatever data with Postman's cloud and then it being public. Even me, and this is just talking about a different feature, but I was testing Postman for a couple months before I knew that there was like a history button in Postman, and I clicked on that history button, And I was pretty shocked that there was every request I made in Postman going back for the last month and a half. And sure enough, there were clear text credentials sitting in there, like some of my credentials even. And I didn't expect it. I had no idea. So I would say, like, even me, I mean, it's easy to make a mistake on Postman. If you do any testing in it, then you do have to be concerned that your secrets might be logged somewhere.
If somebody wants to get their documentation into Postman, they can't easily do testing of that documentation without inadvertently exposing their own secrets. And so people kind of have to just trust that the import worked and that everything is functioning properly without actually testing it out.
Yeah, I mean, if you know all the security implications and where to look and history and environments and how to not sync things with the initial value. If you know all that going into it, yeah, it can be pretty straightforward. Like now at this point, I would feel comfortable testing it and then publishing a private workspace. Like I wouldn't have any issue with it. But your average user, especially ones that are not on the security team, yeah, there's definitely a risk there, especially large enterprises that have very strict security controls in place. Postman's a bit of an unknown. Like the history feature alone, like you could be logging all types of PII in there, like all types of data that you might not want a random developer to just have sitting on their endpoint.
Okay. So one other area of that um, confusion of that public-private field, Postman has a feature to mark a secret as a secret. Can you tell me about that feature?
Yeah, so this one this one really bothers me. Um, I I know developing production code is incredibly difficult, but this is one area where I think it was a big communication mistake between Postman and users. A couple years ago, a bunch of users were petitioning Postman in their community forum to ask for a way to mask secret data, so like API keys and variables, when they're screen sharing. So a lot of folks will be doing like a demo using Postman to say, this is how you set up your API, test it out this way, whatever it may be. And a lot of users didn't want to publicly expose their API key on a screen share. So Postman rolled out a secret type within the environment variable fields and collection variable fields. Well, when I read secret, I'm like, okay, like they're locking down my data. Secret doesn't mean secret. Secret means mask. So they turn all of your password or whatever it may be into a bunch of asterisks, but anybody with access to that workspace can toggle off the asterisks and see the clear text secret. Like I was blown away that they were calling it a secret when it's really just masking. And this is a serious source of confusion, and we back that up with some of our data. Um, one third of the times when we saw a leaked live secret on Postman that was coming from a variable field, they had the secret type selected. So my assumption is, in a third of the cases, folks thought that they actually had made their secret, right? Their API key secret, but in reality, it wasn't safe at all.
Okay, you talked through several features of this. You mentioned a few minutes ago that you don't know what it's like to be a developer over there. You don't know what other competing priorities they might have. But you actually had an opportunity to meet with Postman. You met with their head of security. Tell me about what that was like.
Yeah, so we reached out to the head of IT security. He was super willing to meet with us and discuss secrets leakage that we were finding. I'd say off the bat, he was extremely open to all of our comments. He even expressed alignment on a lot of them. And it sounds like a lot of these issues are known internally. Maybe there's dialogue going on about them. But he did mention that he'd like to correct some of this too.
So when you met with Joshua, would you say it was mostly a positive experience and they're mostly motivated to get these secrets cleaned up and removed?
It was extremely positive. He was very aligned with what we were saying. I don't know the internal politics, the feature priority, how development works inside Postman, so I can't really comment on the second part, but I will say that it's very clear that these issues are known, have been discussed, and they, at least from Joshua's perspective, he's very interested in making their users more secure on Postman.
Let me ask a follow-up question. A few times you've talked about workspaces having more than one credential, more than one authentication mechanism, database passwords. Help me understand that a little bit. Postman, you mentioned, can be used for MQTT, WebSockets, etc. But how do you end up in a situation where one workspace maybe talking to several different providers. How do you end up with database passwords in a platform that's mostly designed for testing HTTP APIs?
It's a great question. There's so many like places within a workspace that secrets could leak. We're putting an article out, I think next week or the week after this presentation, that documents them. But in general, I think we mapped like more than 11 or 12. So like you have global variables, environment variables, collection variables, folder variables, pre-request scripts, post-request scripts. That's JavaScript. You've got HTTP URLs, URL parameters, body data. You've got collection descriptions. There's all these different places within Postman where people could just drop a key. And the bigger thing to note is like workspace is like your organizing unit. Within those are collections. Again, those are logical groupings of HTTP requests. I've seen people with like 100 different collections in a workspace. It could be like OpenAI, OpenWeather, SendGrid, Stripe, and there's just a whole bunch of services that they're testing out, and there's keys for all of those sitting in there.
So you have situations where people are talking to more than one API and have lumped them all into one workspace. So you have like several different API keys in the same workspace.
Yeah, I mean, imagine a QA engineer that is like a contractor, works for a couple of different clients, and just grabs their clients' collections into their one workspace, and now they're dealing with multiple clients in one workspace.
Tell me a little bit more about the database passwords. Are those database passwords being sent via HTTP for some other service to log in? Or is there a way for Postman to directly connect to databases?
Mostly what we were seeing for that was, the short answer is I don't think so. I was seeing a lot of just like authing into like a Mongo instance or like Elasticsearch, like those types of like where you just need like basic auth often to authenticate in. But yeah, I mean, we also saw just like strings for like Postgres. Like did it need to be there? Probably not. Could they use it? I don't think so. I mean, I don't think there's a Postgres client like embedded in there, but I could be wrong.
All right, 10,000-foot view here, knowing what you know about Postman and knowing what you know about developer evangelism and law of large numbers in its current state, would you recommend Postman to developers?
Well, that's a tough question. If developers are crystal clear on the security implications, and there is regular scanning, like continuous scanning for secrets, monitor, and not just secrets, to be honest. I mean, again, I found large companies leaking internal API documentation, just making sure that the docs that are publicly available are not exposing inside details. Then yeah, I mean, who am I to say that like the industry standard tool for API testing and design shouldn't be used? Like, yeah, but if I was in charge of security for a team at the current state, I would want strict controls placed over its usage. I would want extensive ongoing monitoring. That's the only way I would be comfortable with it being used. I would say, I mean, before even doing this research, I used it when I was doing some pen testing work, and like it's a really like the tool works really well. Like I can't say there's anything wrong with like the feature set in it. It's like a great platform. Be careful, you know. So and hopefully, I mean, when we were chatting with the head of security, like his like his interest in the issues that we were bringing forward and the fact that he already knew some of them, most of them, all of them, leads me to believe that hopefully in the near future some of this is corrected, and then at that point I'd have no problem recommending it. But yeah, there are some caveats at the moment.
Well, let me just follow that question up with something you maybe already answered. Do you have any plans to use Postman outside of the secrets research you've already done? Do you plan to use the platform for its intended purpose?
Yeah, I mean, if I need to use like an API, or if I need to do some like API security testing, then yeah, I mean, I've used it for a few years before this role, so I would say yes. But I mean, I know where the skeletons are hidden for secret leakage, so I would make sure that everything I'm doing is private, nothing synced to their servers.
To wrap things up, you talked a little bit just now about PII, you talked about secrets, you talked about elevation of privilege. What would you say is the most surprising thing you found from all of the research into Postman and exposed credentials.
Yeah, the most surprising was a very major defense, industrial, retail manufacturer, household name, has a new cybersecurity AI related tool that they're rolling out. And one of their QA engineers made their entire workspace public. It was crystal clear that the workspace in general shouldn't have been made public, but to make it worse, there was dev, UAT, prod, like OAuth creds, Elastic search creds, like their entire tech stack was just publicly available for the whole world to see. I reached out to them within hours; it was taken down. But that showed me the magnitude of like how severe a case this could be. I mean, hopefully nothing happened. Hopefully nobody else accessed it. But I mean, that's a nightmare. Literally, the entire tech stack, dev through prod, was just available. And I mean, luckily the security team responded, but like maybe they didn't, or maybe they couldn't find who that QA engineer was. If it was a contractor, like that would be a terrible scenario, especially for a new product rollout. So
Wow.
that was the biggest unique case for me.
And so this was basically a workspace that was used internally to talk to internal services or maybe zero trust services that are sitting on the internet but shouldn't be
Yes.
connected to. You had the ability to connect to all of it because not only were the endpoints exposed, but the credentials were as well.
That all of that, and it was clearly documented how to do it. Get token, get refresh token, do this. Like it's API documentation. It steps you through everything you need to do. So everything was laid out super clearly.
If you made it this far, thank you. TruffleHog has always been a free and open source tool on GitHub for finding passwords and API keys where you don't want them. Please go download it and try the new Postman submodule. Right now, there's a lot of work the whole community has to do to get Postman cleaned up because of all those passwords and API keys that are presently sitting on that platform. So please download TruffleHog, start scanning, and let us know what you find.